June 27, 1954. A president walks into a radio studio in Guatemala City, not to speak to his nation with confidence, but to resign in defeat. His government had not been crushed by a real invasion. His military had not been overrun by a superior force. Instead, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman collapsed under something far more insidious: the illusion of collapse, the sounds of bombers overhead, the voice of a rebel general echoing from radios across the country, the whispered threats in the streets, the coffins on doorsteps, the fear that his army, his people, and his allies had already turned against him. And every piece of that nightmare was designed, funded, and executed by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. This was not an invasion. This was theater, and the world believed it. What you are about to hear is the story of how a handful of CIA officers, a single clandestine radio station, a few aging aircraft, and a rebel force of just 480 men toppled a democratically elected government in less than 2 weeks. It is a story of psychological warfare so effective that it convinced an entire nation that it was already defeated before a single major battle had been fought. It is a story of manipulation, propaganda, fear, and power. It is a story about how the modern world learned that conquest no longer required armies. It required belief. And the CIA had just proven they could control belief itself. Guatemala in the early 1950s was not a Soviet satellite. It was not a military dictatorship aligned with Moscow. It was a democracy, fragile and young, that had emerged from decades of authoritarian rule under a revolution in 1944. For the first time in its modern history, Guatemala had elections, labor rights, political parties, and a press that could criticize the government. The new president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, was a military officer who had become a politician, a man who believed his nation could modernize, could break the centuries-old cycle of poverty and exploitation, and could give land to the peasants who worked it. But there was a problem. Most of the arable land in Guatemala was not owned by Guatemalans. It was owned by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation so powerful it was known throughout Central America as El Pulpo, the octopus. United Fruit controlled the railroads, it controlled the ports, it controlled the telegraph lines, and it controlled hundreds of thousands of acres of fertile land, most of which sat idle, untouched, unplanted, held in reserve to manipulate market prices and maintain leverage over the Guatemalan economy. On June 27, 1952, exactly 2 years before his resignation, Arbenz signed Decree 900 into law. It was an agrarian reform program that allowed the government to expropriate uncultivated land from large estates and redistribute it to landless peasants in plots large enough to sustain a family. The compensation offered was based on the declared tax value of the land, the same value the landowners themselves had reported to avoid taxes. United Fruit had declared its land worth far less than its actual value, and now the Guatemalan government was holding them to it. The company was furious. American investors were furious. And in Washington, 2 men who had once worked as lawyers for United Fruit were now in the most powerful intelligence positions in the United States government. John Foster Dulles, now Secretary of State, had been a legal representative for United Fruit. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Together, they convinced President Dwight D. Eisenhower that Arbenz was not simply a nationalist reformer, he was a communist. He was a threat to American security. He was the first domino in a chain that could fall all the way to the Panama Canal, and he had to be removed. Not by open war, not by diplomatic pressure, but by covert action, quietly, deniably, and without leaving fingerprints. The Dulles brothers presented their case with certainty and urgency. They pointed to the presence of communists in Arbenz's government, to his tolerance of leftist labor unions, to his acceptance of support from the Guatemalan Communist Party. They argued that Moscow was gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, that Soviet influence was spreading, that inaction would be catastrophic. Whether they genuinely believed this or whether they were simply protecting corporate interests remains a subject of historical debate. But what is not debatable is that they were persuasive. President Eisenhower, a military man who understood the language of threats and strategic imperatives, authorized the operation. The CIA was given the green light to remove a democratically elected government in a country that posed no direct military threat to the United States. The irony was profound. The United States, which had just fought a world war to defend democracy, which had spent billions rebuilding democratic institutions in Europe and Japan, which presented itself as the champion of freedom and self-determination, was now about to destroy a democracy in the name of protecting democracy. The justification was the Cold War. The reality was something far more complex and far more troubling. And the methods the CIA would use in Guatemala would set a precedent that would haunt American foreign policy for the next 7 decades. In August 1953, President Eisenhower formally authorized Operation PBSUCCESS. The mission was simple in its goal, but extraordinary in its scope. Remove the government of Guatemala without bloodshed if possible, and do it in a way that made it look like an internal uprising, not an American coup. The CIA was given primary responsibility, and Allen Dulles established a temporary command station codenamed Lincoln to plan and execute the operation. The headquarters was set up in Opa-locka, Florida, far from the prying eyes of Congress and the press. The budget was $2.7 million, a modest sum even by 1950s standards. But the CIA was not planning to buy an army. It was planning to buy an illusion. The objective was psychological warfare and political action, subversion and sabotage, propaganda and intimidation. The agency understood from the beginning that they could not win a conventional war in Guatemala. The Guatemalan army had thousands of soldiers, artillery, and defensive positions across the country. The ragtag force of exiles and mercenaries the CIA was recruiting could never defeat them in open combat. So, the strategy was not to fight the Guatemalan army. It was to convince the Guatemalan army that they had already lost. It was to create the illusion of overwhelming force, inevitable defeat, and internal betrayal. The CIA assembled a team of officers who had experience in psychological operations, paramilitary training, and covert political action. Many of them had served in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, where they had learned the dark arts of sabotage, propaganda, and unconventional warfare. They brought those skills to Guatemala, adapting them for a new kind of conflict, one where the battlefield was not a physical space, but the human mind. They studied the techniques used by the Nazis to terrorize populations, the methods used by the Allies to undermine enemy morale, and the lessons of recent covert operations in Iran, where the CIA had successfully orchestrated the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh just 1 year earlier in 1953. The Iran operation, codenamed Team Ajax, had proven that regime change through covert action was possible. It had shown that a combination of bribery, propaganda, street protests, and military pressure could topple a government without direct American military intervention. The success in Iran emboldened the CIA and convinced policymakers that the same approach could work in Guatemala. But there was a crucial difference. In Iran, the CIA had been able to work with existing power structures, with military officers and political factions that were already opposed to Mossadegh. In Guatemala, the CIA would have to create those structures from scratch. They would have to build an opposition, manufacture a crisis, and orchestrate a collapse in a country where Arbenz still enjoyed significant popular support. The planning phase took months. CIA officers traveled throughout Central America, meeting with Guatemalan exiles, recruiting informants, establishing safe houses, and identifying potential assets. They made contact with disaffected military officers, with wealthy landowners who opposed land reform, with church leaders who feared communism, and with businessmen who had lost influence under Arbenz. They built a network of collaborators, some of whom were motivated by ideology, others by money, and still others by personal grievances. The CIA exploited every division, every resentment, every fear they could find, and where those fears did not exist, they created them. The agency also reached out to neighboring governments, seeking their cooperation and support. Honduras and Nicaragua, both ruled by right-wing dictatorships friendly to the United States, agreed to provide training bases, airfields, and logistical support for the operation. El Salvador allowed the CIA to use its territory for communications and supply routes. The governments of these countries were told that they were helping to stop the spread of communism in Central America, that they were defending their own security by assisting in the removal of Arbenz. Whether they believed this or whether they simply saw an opportunity to gain favor with Washington is unclear, but they cooperated, and that cooperation was essential to the success of the operation. By early 1954, the pieces were in place. The CIA had its bases, its networks, its funding, and its plan. All it needed now was a leader, a face for the rebellion, someone who could be presented to the world as the legitimate alternative to Arbenz. And they found him in a man named Carlos Castillo Armas. Carlos Castillo Armas was not a visionary. He was not a charismatic revolutionary. He was not a military genius. He was a failed coup plotter who had spent years in exile nursing his resentment and waiting for another chance at power. In 1949, he had attempted to overthrow the Guatemalan government with a small group of followers. The coup had failed miserably, and Castillo Armas had been captured, imprisoned, and sentenced to death. But he escaped, fled to Honduras, and spent the next few years plotting his return. The CIA had been aware of Castillo Armas for years. They had monitored his activities, assessed his potential, and eventually decided that he was the right man for their purposes. He was not the most talented candidate. He was not the most popular. But he was willing. He was controllable. And he was desperate enough to do whatever the CIA asked of him. The agency put him on the payroll, paying him $3,000 a month to maintain a small rebel force and to be ready when the time came. That time had come. Castillo Armas was not told the full scope of the operation. He was not briefed on the psychological warfare campaign, the radio broadcasts, or the extent of CIA involvement. He was simply told to prepare his men, to cross the border when ordered, and to advance as far as he could. The CIA would handle the rest. And Castillo Armas, eager for power and willing to accept any help he could get, agreed. He became the public face of the rebellion, the leader of what the CIA called the Army of Liberation. But he was not the one in control. The CIA was. The agency established training camps in Honduras and Nicaragua, where Castillo Armas's recruits were taught basic infantry tactics, weapons handling, and guerrilla warfare techniques. The force was never large. At its peak, it numbered between 150 and 480 men, depending on which source you consult. Many of them were Guatemalan exiles, men who had fled the country for political or economic reasons and saw the CIA-backed rebellion as their chance to return. Others were mercenaries from neighboring countries, soldiers of fortune who were paid to fight. And a few were true believers, anti-communists who genuinely thought they were saving Guatemala from Soviet domination. The training was rudimentary. The CIA did not have time or resources to turn these men into an elite fighting force. And it did not matter. The Army of Liberation was never meant to win battles. It was meant to exist, to be seen, to be talked about, to create the impression of a powerful rebel movement that was growing, organizing, and preparing to strike. The CIA wanted Arbenz to know that an invasion was coming. They wanted his generals to worry. They wanted his supporters to doubt. They wanted the entire country to feel that change was inevitable, that resistance was futile, that the government's days were numbered. And to amplify that message, to spread that fear, to create that sense of impending doom, the CIA deployed its most powerful weapon. Not guns, not bombs, but a voice on the radio. In early May 1954, a radio station appeared on the airwaves in Guatemala. It called itself the Voice of Liberation, La Voz de la Liberación. It claimed to be broadcasting from deep inside Guatemala, from the mountains, from rebel-held territory. Its announcers spoke in urgent, dramatic tones, reporting battles, defections, and uprisings across the country. They named towns that had supposedly fallen to the Liberation Army. They announced that entire army units had switched sides. They warned of plots to poison wells and conscript children into communist youth brigades. None of it was true. The station was not in Guatemala. It was broadcasting from a transmitter located on a dairy farm in a neighboring country, a site the CIA codenamed Sherwood. The voice behind the microphone was not a rebel commander. It was David Atlee Phillips, a CIA contract officer, an amateur actor, and a skilled dramatist who understood the power of radio to shape reality. Phillips had studied theater and advertising before joining the CIA, and he brought those skills to his work. He knew how to craft a narrative, how to build suspense, how to make listeners believe what they were hearing even when it contradicted everything they knew to be true. The CIA had studied the techniques of wartime propaganda, the methods used by Allied broadcasters during World War II to demoralize enemy populations and bolster resistance movements. They had examined the panic caused by Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, when a fictional alien invasion was presented so convincingly that thousands of Americans believed it was real. They wanted to create the same sense of unstoppable catastrophe, the same feeling that resistance was pointless because the outcome was already decided, and they succeeded. Phillips and his team worked around the clock, writing scripts, recording announcements, and broadcasting them across Guatemala. They created fictional characters, invented battles, and fabricated victories. They reported that rebel forces had captured key towns, that government troops were deserting in droves, that popular uprisings were erupting in the countryside. They mixed real news with false reports, blurring the line between fact and fiction so thoroughly that listeners could not tell the difference. When the Guatemalan government issued denials, the Voice of Liberation mocked them, suggesting that the denials themselves were proof that the regime was panicking. In mid-May, the Guatemalan state radio station went off the air temporarily to replace its antenna. Phillips immediately moved his frequency closer to the state station's signal, so that when Guatemalans turned their dials looking for official news, they found the Voice of Liberation instead. Suddenly, the rebel station was everywhere. Its signal was boosted. Its reach expanded. By late May, it was being heard loud and clear in Guatemala City, and the announcers were responding in real time to events in the capital, creating the illusion that they had agents and informants everywhere. The content was carefully designed to maximize psychological impact. The broadcasts praised Guatemalan military officers who had not yet defected, hoping to make Arbenz suspicious of them. They called out by name government officials and labor leaders, accusing them of crimes, warning them that their time was running out. They encouraged underground partisan cells to organize against the government, even though most of those cells did not exist. And they constantly repeated the message that the Liberation Army was massive, well-armed, and unstoppable, that it was advancing from multiple directions, that it would soon be at the gates of Guatemala City. The Guatemalan government tried to counter the broadcasts with its own propaganda, but it was a losing battle. The Voice of Liberation was more compelling, more dramatic, more convincing. It sounded like news. It felt like truth. And in the absence of reliable information, people believed it. Soldiers in remote garrisons, hearing that their comrades had defected, began to wonder if they should do the same. Government officials, hearing their names called out on the radio, began to fear for their lives. Citizens, hearing reports of rebel advances, began to stockpile food and prepare for chaos. The Voice of Liberation was not just reporting a rebellion, it was creating one. While the Voice of Liberation attacked minds, the CIA prepared to attack nerves. The agency had acquired a small number of aircraft, old planes left over from World War II. There were P-47 Thunderbolts, F-51 Mustangs, and C-47 transport planes, all of them purchased quietly through front companies and shell corporations. They were piloted not by Guatemalan rebels, but by American pilots working under CIA contract, mercenaries and adventurers who were paid handsomely to fly dangerous missions over a foreign country. These planes were not going to destroy the Guatemalan military. They could not. They were too few, too old, and too lightly armed. But that was never the point. The point was to make noise, to create fear, to convince people that an air force was overhead, that nowhere was safe, that the government could not protect them. The CIA's Psychological Strategy Board authorized what they called a nerve war against individuals. This was not a battle. It was a campaign of targeted terror. Death threats were sent to political leaders deemed loyal to Arbenz or suspected of communist sympathies. Small wooden coffins were delivered to their homes. Bombs that would not detonate were left on doorsteps. Hangman's nooses appeared in mailboxes. For 30 consecutive days, death notice cards were sent to known or suspected communist leaders, one every single day, reminding them that they were being watched, that they were marked, that their names were on a list. The psychological impact of these tactics was profound. Imagine receiving a wooden coffin on your doorstep with your name carved into it. Imagine opening your mail and finding a death threat. Not once, but every single day for a month. Imagine hearing bombers overhead, not knowing where they would strike, not knowing if your home, your workplace, your children's school would be the next target. This was not warfare in the traditional sense. This was psychological torture, designed to break morale, to create paranoia, to make people feel that resistance was not just futile but suicidal. The CIA also reached out to the Catholic Church, one of the most powerful institutions in Guatemalan society. Officers made covert contact with church leaders throughout the countryside and persuaded them to incorporate anti-government messages into their Sunday sermons. The priests spoke of communist atheism, of the threat to religion, of the moral duty to resist. Intelligence gathered by the CIA about local communities, about their fears and their faith, was fed directly into these sermons. Psychological intelligence became spiritual authority. The church became a weapon. E. Howard Hunt, a CIA officer involved in the operation, later described the bombing strategy in blunt terms. He said they wanted to create a terror campaign, to terrify Arbenz, to terrify his troops, in the same way that German Stuka dive bombers had terrorized the populations of Holland, Belgium, and Poland during World War II. The goal was not to kill. The goal was to break morale, to make soldiers believe that fighting back was suicide, to make government officials believe that loyalty was a death sentence. The first bombing raids began in mid-May, weeks before the actual invasion. The CIA pilots struck a variety of targets: fuel depots, radio towers, military barracks, airfields. The damage was minimal. Most of the bombs missed their targets or failed to detonate, but the sound of the engines, the sight of the planes, the explosions in the distance, all of it created the impression of a massive air campaign. The Voice of Liberation amplified the effect, reporting exaggerated casualty figures, claiming that entire military installations had been destroyed, warning that more raids were coming. And the people of Guatemala, with no way to verify the truth, believed what they heard. The CIA also used leaflet drops, scattering propaganda over cities and towns. The leaflets carried messages designed to demoralize government forces and encourage defections. Some claimed that the Liberation Army was unstoppable, that it had superior weapons and training, that resistance would only lead to death. Others offered amnesty to soldiers who deserted, promising them safety and even financial rewards if they switched sides. Still others warned civilians to stay indoors, to avoid government buildings, to prepare for combat in their neighborhoods. None of it was based on reality, but it did not need to be. It only needed to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What would you do if your government told you everything was fine, but the radio said your country was collapsing? If official statements said the army was strong, but you heard bombers overhead every night? If your leaders insisted there was no invasion, but your neighbors were fleeing in panic? The genius of the CIA's psychological warfare campaign was that it exploited the gap between official narratives and personal experience. It made people trust their fear more than their government. And once that trust was broken, the government's authority evaporated. On June 18, 1954, 3 days after the initial reports, Castillo Armas and his Liberation Army finally crossed the border into Guatemala. The The force was divided into 4 small teams, ranging in size from 60 to 198 men. The largest unit was supposed to attack the Atlantic port town of Puerto Barrios, while the others targeted smaller frontier towns like Esquipulas, Jutiapa, and Zacapa. The plan was to seize these towns quickly, establish a foothold inside Guatemala, and then advance toward the capital. But from the beginning, nothing went as planned. The rebel units were poorly coordinated, they lacked supplies, they had minimal training and even less discipline. The first team to cross the border managed to capture the small town of Esquipulas with little resistance, but they advanced no further. The second team, heading toward Jutiapa, was stopped by a small Guatemalan army garrison and forced to retreat. The third team, targeting Puerto Barrios, was supposed to launch an amphibious assault with the support of CIA aircraft, but the attack was delayed by logistical problems and bad weather. The fourth team never even made it across the border, turning back after reports of government reinforcements in the area. The invasion was failing. Castillo Armas sent urgent requests to the CIA for more support, particularly more aircraft. One of his planes had been shot down by ground fire and another had crashed due to mechanical failure. He was down to just 2 or 3 operational aircraft, not nearly enough to sustain the illusion of air superiority. President Eisenhower, despite concerns from some advisors who worried about the political fallout if American involvement became public, personally authorized the deployment of additional planes. The CIA scrambled to find replacement aircraft, purchasing them through front companies and flying them into the region under cover of darkness. The bombers continued their raids over Guatemala City and other towns, hitting a wide variety of targets, most of which were of little military value. A fuel depot here, a radio tower there, a government building, a military barracks. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was massive. Citizens heard the engines, they saw the smoke, they believed the stories on the radio. They believed the Liberation Army was larger, stronger, and closer than it really was. Meanwhile, the Guatemalan military was paralyzed by indecision. Officers did not know if their own ranks had been infiltrated. They did not know who to trust. The flood of disinformation, the radio broadcasts, the bombing raids, the rumors of defections, all of it created a fog of uncertainty so thick that coordinated resistance became nearly impossible. Some officers wanted to fight. Others wanted to negotiate. Still others wanted to overthrow Arbenz themselves and seize power before Castillo Armas could. The chain of command fractured, communication broke down, and in the chaos, the Liberation Army, weak and disorganized as it was, continued to exist, continued to broadcast its presence, continued to be talked about as if it were a real threat. The key battle, if it can be called that, took place in the town of Zacapa. A small Guatemalan garrison was stationed there, blocking one of the main routes to the capital. Castillo Armas's forces needed to take Zacapa to maintain the illusion of momentum. CIA aircraft bombed the town repeatedly, targeting the garrison and trying to force the defenders to withdraw. The Guatemalan soldiers held their ground for several days, inflicting casualties on the rebels and repelling their attacks. But then, inexplicably, they received orders to retreat. The orders came not from field commanders, but from senior officers in Guatemala City who had been convinced by the CIA's propaganda campaign that the situation was hopeless, that reinforcements were not coming, that the government was about to collapse. Zacapa fell not because it was defeated, but because it was abandoned. And that abandonment, broadcast loudly by the voice of liberation, became the turning point. The fall of Zacapa was presented as proof that the Liberation Army was unstoppable, that the government's defenses were crumbling, that the end was near. And the people of Guatemala, soldiers and civilians alike, believed it. Jacobo Arbenz was trapped in a nightmare of the CIA's creation. Every piece of intelligence he received told him that his government was collapsing. His generals hesitated. His allies wavered. His radio was filled with rebel broadcasts. His skies were filled with bombers. And the United States, publicly neutral, was quietly signaling that it would not tolerate his survival. He was a soldier who had become a president, and now He was a president who could not command his own army. Arbenz had tried to rally support. He had armed civilian militias, hoping that popular resistance could make up for military weakness. He had appealed to the international community, asking the United Nations to intervene and condemn the invasion. He had reached out to neighboring countries, seeking military aid, but no help came. The United States used its influence to block UN action. Mexico and other potential allies refused to get involved, and the civilian militias, enthusiastic but untrained, were no match for even the small rebel force that had crossed the border. The psychological pressure on Arbenz was immense. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He was surrounded by advisors who gave him conflicting information, some telling him to fight, others telling him to flee. His military commanders were evasive, non-committal, unwilling to commit their forces to a battle they believed was already lost. And every day, the voice of liberation mocked him, called him a coward, a tyrant, a puppet of Moscow. The broadcasts claimed that his own guards were plotting to kill him, that his cabinet was preparing to betray him, that his wife and children were in danger. On June 25th, 2 days before his resignation, Arbenz met with his senior military officers. He asked them directly if they would fight. The answers he received were vague and non-committal. Some officers said they would need more weapons, more ammunition, more air support. Others said they needed time to assess the situation, to determine the strength of the rebel forces. Still others said nothing at all, simply staring at the floor, unwilling to commit. Arbenz realized in that moment that he had lost, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been abandoned. On the evening of June 27, 1954, just 12 days after the invasion began, Arbenz went on the radio and resigned. He did not resign because his army had been defeated. He resigned because he believed it was about to be. He resigned because he had been convinced that resistance was hopeless, that the United States would intervene directly if necessary, that the game was already over. And that belief, that psychological surrender, was exactly what the CIA had been engineering from the very beginning. In his resignation speech, Arbenz blamed the United States for orchestrating the coup. He said that American economic interests, specifically the United Fruit Company, had conspired with the CIA to destroy his government. He said that the invasion was not a popular uprising but a foreign intervention. He was right, but it did not matter. The world was not listening. The United States denied involvement. The press reported the story as an internal rebellion, a popular revolt against a communist government, and within days, the narrative the CIA had created became the accepted truth. After Arbenz's resignation, a brief power struggle ensued among military officers. Some wanted to continue fighting. Others wanted to negotiate with Castillo Armas. Still others wanted to seize power themselves. The CIA, working behind the scenes, manipulated the situation to ensure that Castillo Armas emerged victorious. By July 3, 1954, he was installed as the provisional president of Guatemala. The operation had cost less than $3 million. It had involved fewer than 500 rebel fighters. It had relied almost entirely on deception, intimidation, and illusion, and it had worked. What happened next was brutal and methodical. More than 9,000 Guatemalan citizens were arrested in the weeks following the coup. Labor leaders, government officials, teachers, activists, anyone suspected of communist sympathies or loyalty to Arbenz was rounded up. The CIA had prepared lists. They called it the K program, their assassination and detention protocol. The main list, the A list, contained 58 names of individuals marked for assassination. Every single name on that list was excised from the declassified documents, redacted, hidden from public view even decades later. The CIA's own internal studies later stated that up until the day Arbenz resigned, assassination was still being considered as an option. Training manuals had been prepared, operatives had been instructed, weapons had been distributed. But according to the agency's official record, none of the planned assassinations were actually carried out. Whether that is true, or whether it is simply what the CIA chose to document, is a question that remains unanswered. What is known is that on June 30th, 1954, just 3 days after the coup, the CIA began a comprehensive and systematic destruction of documents related to Operation PBSUCCESS. When a United States Senate Oversight Committee investigated the CIA's assassination programs in 1975 and requested files on PBSUCCESS, the agency claimed it had lost all such records. The new government led by Castillo Armas reversed Decree 900 immediately. The land reform program was dismantled. The peasants who had received land were forced to return it. United Fruit regained its holdings. The labor unions were banned. Political parties were outlawed. The brief experiment in Guatemalan democracy was over. What followed was not liberation. It was repression. Castillo Armas ruled as a military dictator until his assassination in 1957, and he was followed by a succession of authoritarian regimes, military juntas, and governments that relied on violence and fear to maintain control. The purge was not limited to political opponents. The CIA and the new Guatemalan government targeted anyone who had supported land reform, anyone who had been active in labor unions, anyone who had criticized United Fruit or American influence. Thousands of people were imprisoned without trial. Torture became routine. Disappearances became common. The terror that the CIA had manufactured during the coup became the reality of life in post-coup Guatemala. Guatemala descended into decades of civil war, death squads, and genocidal campaigns against indigenous populations. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Entire villages were destroyed. The country that the CIA had claimed to save from communism became a graveyard, and the fingerprints of Operation PBSUCCESS were on every part of that nightmare. For the CIA, PBSUCCESS was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. It was proof that covert action could achieve what diplomacy and open war could not. It demonstrated that a small, well-planned psychological operation could topple a government, reshape a nation, and do it all while maintaining plausible deniability for the United States. The techniques refined in Guatemala, the use of radio propaganda, the deployment of paramilitary proxies, the manipulation of fear and misinformation, the psychological warfare tactics, all of it became a template for future operations. The agency studied PBSUCCESS intensely. Officers involved in the operation went on to lead other covert actions around the world. David Atlee Phillips, the voice of Radio Liberation, became one of the CIA's most senior officers in Latin America, eventually serving as chief of the Western Hemisphere Division. E. Howard Hunt, who helped design the terror campaign, later became infamous for his role in the Watergate scandal that brought down President Richard Nixon. Richard Bissell, who coordinated logistics for PBSUCCESS, went on to oversee the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. The lessons of Guatemala were applied in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Chile, in Nicaragua, in every theater where the CIA believed that influence and intimidation could replace invasion. But the legacy of PBSUCCESS was not just operational, it was ideological. It taught the CIA that reality was negotiable, that perception could be engineered, that truth was less important than the story people believed. It taught American policymakers that regime change could be achieved on a budget, that governments could be removed without congressional approval, without public debate, without accountability. It normalized covert action as a tool of foreign policy. It made the invisible hand of American power a permanent feature of the Cold War. And it taught the rest of the world a darker lesson. It taught them that democracy, even legitimate, popular, elected democracy, could be destroyed if it threatened American economic interests. It taught them that sovereignty was conditional, that independence was an illusion, that the rules-based international order was only as strong as the willingness of powerful nations to respect it. And for many people in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, it taught them that the greatest threat to their freedom was not the Soviet Union. It was the United States. The techniques used in Guatemala did not stay in Guatemala. The CIA exported them. In 1961, the agency attempted to replicate PBSUCCESS in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The operation used the same formula: a small exile force, psychological warfare, air support, and the hope that the Cuban people would rise up against Fidel Castro. But Cuba was not Guatemala. Castro's military was stronger, more disciplined, and more loyal. The Cuban people did not defect. The invasion failed catastrophically, becoming one of the most embarrassing episodes in CIA history. But the CIA did not abandon the formula. It refined it. In Chile in 1973, the agency orchestrated the overthrow of Salvador Allende, another democratically elected socialist leader, using economic pressure, media manipulation, and military conspiracy. In Nicaragua in the 1980s, the CIA armed and trained the Contras, a rebel force fighting against the Sandinista government, using many of the same tactics perfected in Guatemala. In Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, the United States has repeatedly tried to shape political outcomes through covert means, through proxy forces, through information warfare, through the same belief that reality can be engineered if you control the narrative. If you've made it this far, you're seeing how intelligence agencies don't just gather information. They create it, they shape it, they weaponize it. And if this story has made you think about power, about truth, about the systems that control what we believe, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, because this is the kind of history they don't teach, the kind of story that gets buried in classified files and redacted documents. And drop a comment below. One question: do you think covert operations like PBSUCCESS make the world safer, or do they create more problems than they solve? I want to know where you stand. The full truth of Operation PBSUCCESS is still hidden. Thousands of pages of CIA documents remain classified. The names on the assassination lists are still redacted. The details of who knew what, who gave which orders, who carried out which operations, much of that remains locked away in agency vaults. The CIA's official history of the operation, written by historian Nicholas Calather in 1994, was only partially declassified. Even decades after the fact, even after the Cold War ended, even after the Soviet Union collapsed and the ideological justification for the coup evaporated, the agency continues to protect the secrets of Guatemala. Why? What is still so sensitive, so dangerous, so damaging that it cannot be revealed? Is it the identities of collaborators, of foreign officials who helped the CIA, of informants who betrayed their own government? Is it evidence of crimes that were committed, of assassinations that were carried out despite official denials? Is it simply the CIA's desire to protect its methods, its sources, its reputation? Or is it something deeper, something more troubling, a recognition that if the full story were told, the moral foundation of American intelligence work would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? The people of Guatemala never got answers. The families of those who were killed, those who disappeared, those who were tortured in the decades that followed, they never got justice. The peasants who were given land under Decree 900 and then had it taken away, they never got restitution. The democracy that was destroyed in 1954 was never restored, and the CIA never apologized. The methods used in Guatemala did not stay in Guatemala. They became doctrine. They became tradition. They became the invisible architecture of American foreign policy for the next 70 years. The idea that a government could be removed not by visible force, but by invisible pressure, not by invasion, but by subversion, not by honesty, but by deception, that idea did not die in 1954. It evolved. It adapted. It spread. You can see it in the Phoenix program in Vietnam, where targeted killings and intimidation were used to destroy the Viet Cong's political infrastructure. You can see it in the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, where economic pressure, media manipulation, and military conspiracy brought down another democratically elected socialist government. You can see it in the Contra War in Nicaragua in the 1980s, where the CIA again armed and trained rebel forces to destabilize a government it opposed. And you can see it in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in every place where the United States has tried to shape political outcomes through covert means rather than open diplomacy. The technology has changed. The radio broadcasts have been replaced by social media campaigns. The wooden coffins have been replaced by cyber attacks and targeted drone strikes. The CIA pilots flying old World War II bombers have been replaced by autonomous systems and signals intelligence. But the core strategy remains the same: create fear, control information, manipulate perception, make the target believe they are already defeated, and then watch as they collapse from within. The lesson of PB success is not that covert action is effective. The lesson is that covert action is seductive. It offers the illusion of control, the promise of results without consequences, the fantasy that you can change the world without leaving fingerprints. But the fingerprints are always there, the consequences are always real, and the cost is always paid, not by the architects of the operation, but by the people who live in the countries where the operation is carried out. The CIA's psychological warfare campaign in Guatemala was a masterpiece of manipulation. It was brilliant in its design, ruthless in its execution, and devastatingly effective in its results. But effectiveness is not the same as morality. Success is not the same as justice. And power without accountability is not strength. It is tyranny. Guatemala in 2026 is still recovering from 1954. The civil war that followed the coup lasted until 1996, 42 years of violence, of massacres, of disappearances. More than 200,000 people were killed, the vast majority of them indigenous Mayans targeted by government forces and paramilitary death squads. Truth commissions established after the war documented crimes against humanity, acts of genocide, systematic torture, and rape used as weapons of terror. And they traced the origins of that violence back to the moment when Jacobo Arbenz stepped down from power and Carlos Castillo Armas took his place. The United States government has never formally apologized for its role in the 1954 coup. President Bill Clinton, during a visit to Guatemala in 1999, acknowledged that American support for military regimes in Guatemala was wrong and that the United States must not repeat that mistake. But he did not call it a coup. He did not name the CIA. He did not offer reparations. The acknowledgement was vague, diplomatic, carefully worded to avoid legal liability or moral responsibility. It was an apology without an apology, a recognition without a reckoning. The people who planned and executed Operation PBSUCCESS went on to long and successful careers. Allen Dulles remained director of the CIA until 1961, when he was forced to resign after the Bay of Pigs disaster. John Foster Dulles served as Secretary of State until his death in 1959, celebrated as one of the architects of American Cold War strategy. The CIA officers who ran the radio stations, who trained the rebels, who flew the bombing missions, most of them received commendations, promotions, and prestigious postings. They were not punished, they were rewarded. Because in the world of intelligence, success is measured not by morality, but by results. And in that calculus, PBSUCCESS was a success. But what was actually achieved? A government was removed, yes. But was it replaced by stability? No. By democracy? No. By prosperity? No. By peace? No. It was replaced by violence, by dictatorship, by poverty, by suffering that lasted for generations. The stated goal of the operation was to prevent communism from spreading in Central America. But the actual result was to radicalize an entire region, to teach millions of people that the United States was not a defender of freedom, but an enemy of self-determination, to drive many of them into the arms of the very ideologies the CIA claimed to be fighting. The operation was a success for the CIA. It was a success for United Fruit. It was a success for the American officials who wanted to prove that covert action worked. But it was a catastrophe for Guatemala. And that raises a question that has never been answered, not in 1954, not in 1994 when the CIA's internal history was partially declassified, not in 2026 as we look back on this story. Whose success matters, whose failure counts, and who gets to decide? The story of PBSUCCESS is not just the story of one operation in one country in 1 year. It is the story of a philosophy, a worldview, a belief system that said the ends justify the means, that American interests justify any action, that secrecy is more important than accountability. It is the story of an agency that was given extraordinary power, minimal oversight, and a mandate to do whatever was necessary to protect national security without anyone clearly defining what national security meant or who it was meant to protect. The CIA did not invent covert action. Intelligence agencies have been manipulating foreign governments, spreading disinformation, and conducting secret wars for as long as nations have existed. But the scale, the sophistication, the industrialization of covert action that emerged in the Cold War, that was something new. PBSUCCESS was one of the first times that an intelligence agency used modern mass media, psychological operations, and paramilitary force in a coordinated campaign to overthrow a government, and it worked so well that it became the model for every operation that followed. But here is what the architects of PBSUCCESS did not anticipate. They did not anticipate that their success would create resentment, that their deception would breed distrust, that their actions would inspire resistance. They did not anticipate that the people of Guatemala would remember, that they would tell their children, that those children would grow up knowing that their democracy had been stolen, that their president had been overthrown, that their land had been taken, and that the United States had done it. They did not anticipate that the techniques they used to destabilize one government could be studied, copied, and used against them. They did not anticipate that the world they were shaping would one day look back at their actions not with admiration, but with horror. The invisible war the CIA fought in Guatemala was never invisible to the Guatemalans. They saw the planes, they heard the radio, they received the threats, they buried the dead, and they remembered. The CIA's greatest achievement in PBSUCCESS was creating the illusion of overwhelming force, the illusion that resistance was futile, the illusion that the outcome was already determined. But illusions do not last. They crack, they fade, and eventually the truth comes out. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. The bombing raids that terrified Guatemala City were carried out by a handful of planes, sometimes just one or two at a time, flying multiple sorties to create the impression of a larger air force. The Liberation Army that was described on the radio as a massive, unstoppable force was in reality a few hundred poorly trained men who advanced less than 30 miles into Guatemalan territory. The popular uprising that supposedly swept the countryside was manufactured almost entirely in CIA offices and broadcast from a transmitter on a dairy farm. The invasion was an illusion. The collapse was real. On July 2, 1954, the Voice of Liberation broadcast its final transmission. The mission was complete. Arbenz was gone. Castillo Armas was in power. The CIA had won. David Atlee Phillips packed up his equipment, shut down the transmitter, and disappeared back into the shadows of the intelligence world. The radio station that had terrified a nation, that had convinced an army not to fight, that had helped topple a government, simply vanished, as if it had never existed, as if it had all been a dream. But the echoes of that broadcast never stopped. They continued in the decades of violence that followed. They continued in the Cold War operations that copied its methods. They continued in the distrust that Latin America still feels toward the United States. They continued in the declassified documents that slowly, grudgingly revealed pieces of the truth. And they continue today, in every covert operation, every psychological warfare campaign, every attempt to shape reality through deception and fear. The lesson of Guatemala is not that covert action is inevitable. It is not that intelligence agencies must operate without oversight. It is not that the ends always justify the means. The lesson is that power without accountability is not strength. It is corruption. That secrecy without transparency is not security. It is tyranny. And that a nation that destroys democracy abroad in the name of defending democracy at home will eventually lose the ability to distinguish between the two. In June 1954, a small group of men in Washington decided that the government of Guatemala was a threat that had to be eliminated. They did not ask the Guatemalan people. They did not seek approval from Congress. They did not present evidence to the United Nations. They simply decided and they acted, and they succeeded. And the cost of that success is still being paid 72 years later by people who had no say in the decision, no voice in the operation, no choice in the outcome. Jacobo Arbenz lived the rest of his life in exile, moving from country to country, never able to return home, a man haunted by the government he lost and the forces that took it from him. He died in Mexico City in 1971, largely forgotten by the world, his name a footnote in the history of the Cold War. But in Guatemala, he is remembered, not as a communist, not as a threat, but as a leader who tried to give land to the landless, who tried to build a democracy, who tried to stand up to power, and who was destroyed for it. Or the CIA proved in 1954 that it could collapse a government with radio broadcasts, a few airplanes, and a well-constructed lie. But it could not answer the question that has followed that operation ever since. Was it worth it? Was the short-term victory worth the long-term catastrophe? Was the illusion of control worth the reality of chaos? And if the answer is no, if the cost was too high, if the consequences were too severe, then why does the playbook still exist? Why are the methods still taught? Why are the operations still conducted? Those questions do not have easy answers. They do not have comfortable answers. But they are the questions we must ask if we want to understand not just what happened in Guatemala in 1954, but what continues to happen in different forms, in different countries, in different ways today. The story of Operation PBSUCCESS is not ancient history. It is a living legacy, a warning, a reminder that the tools we create, the strategies we deploy, the illusions we craft, they do not disappear when the mission is over. They echo, they spread, and they shape the world in ways we cannot predict and cannot control. This is the story of how the CIA collapsed Guatemala overnight, but it is also the story of how power, once unleashed, can never be fully contained, how deception, once normalized, becomes impossible to escape, and how the pursuit of control, no matter how successful, always comes at a price. The only question is who pays it. And in Guatemala, the payment is still being made by people who were not even born when the voice of liberation first crackled to life on their radios, telling them that their world was ending. The broadcast was fake, the ending was real, and the cost has never stopped accumulating.